What is going on, guys? It is Wrestlelamia here, back with another video. Vice's Dark Side of the Ring 2-part episode on Chris Benoit has come and gone, but what exactly have we learned? Join us now as Wrestlelamia looks at this special documentary and asks whether it uncovered any new information. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for daily wrestling videos. Chris Benoit's 2007 crimes against his wife Nancy and son Daniel, along with his subsequent ending of his own life, has been discussed in detail ever since it happened, which had some wondering what more could possibly be added to the story. The story was covered intensely in the media, albeit with different levels of accuracy, as well as in several books including Matthew Randazzo's Ring of Hell, Scott Keith's Dungeon of Death, Chris Benoit and the Hart Family Curse, Benoit wrestling with the horror that destroyed a family, and many more. Now, long before Dark Side of the Ring aired, Wrestlelamia produced a number of videos on the sometimes seamy side of professional wrestling, which means our intrepid staff has done exhaustive research on a variety of topics, including the Benoit crimes. As such, it was interesting to see what was covered, what wasn't, and what new ground, if any, was unearthed. The 2-part episode has two major things going for it. It's a well-made documentary with good production values and a number of interviews with those closest to Chris and Nancy, and this includes individuals from the wrestling industry such as Chris Jericho, Vicky Guerrero, Chavo Guerrero, Dean Malenko and Jim Ross, along with Nancy Benoit's sister, Sandra Toffolani. These interviews provided considerable insight into who Benoit was and how his last weekend on Earth still affects them. While the documentary rehashes much of what has been covered before, it does cover some new ground, which we'll discuss at length, followed by what wasn't covered. First, let's look at those shocking revelations that were discovered. As number 1, Benoit was a perfectionist. Although it's been established that Chris Benoit was passionate about his craft, Chris Jericho provides further insight into Benoit's personality, recalling an incident backstage where he found Benoit doing 500 squats for screwing up a move in the ring. When Jericho asked him who told him to do the squats, Benoit said he was doing it to make up for his mistake. Number 2. Physical alterations between Kevin and Nancy. While it's been long known that there were domestic squabbles between Chris and Nancy, this documentary uncovered a previously underscored series of domestic abuse between Kevin Sullivan and Nancy during their marriage. This program discusses how Sullivan booked Nancy and Chris together, leading to their unexpected real-life romance, a story that's been told many times. It goes further, however, revealing several incidents where Sullivan allegedly beat Benoit, on one occasion resulting in a black eye. This led to Nancy seeking comfort in Chris's arms and may explain why Benoit threw some stiff punches at Sullivan during their 1996 match at Bash at the Beach, reportedly causing permanent damage to Sullivan's eardrum. After the match, Chris spirited Nancy's sister Sandra to Nancy where she announced she was leaving Sullivan. This portion of the Chris and Nancy romance has often been glossed over, and it may explain why Nancy and Chris became an item. Number 3. More perspective into the Eddie and Chris friendship. While it's long been established that Chris was close friends with Eddie Guerrero, the people interviewed noticed the parallels between them and why it furthered their friendship. Jericho and Chavo discussed how both Chris and Eddie sacrificed so much for their business, putting their personal lives on hold in order to hone their craft, essentially giving their lives for their art. While the episode is about Chris Benoit, it goes into significant details about Eddie's substance abuse problems. In part 1, Vicky Guerrero reveals Eddie overdosed 3 times at home. Guerrero candidly explains how she didn't bother calling paramedics after their second overdose because the hospital released Eddie after a day, and she basically left Eddie's health in God's hands as she left the home with their children. Number 4. Eddie's death and its impact on Chris. Eddie Guerrero's shocking passing reverberated throughout the wrestling community, affecting Chris Benoit. While the theory that Eddie's passing hurt Benoit immensely, this documentary provides some incredible examples of how Guerrero's passing devastated Benoit. Chavo recalls telling Chris that Eddie passed away and hearing an unbelievable wailing over the phone. Normally a reserved man, Benoit showed unprecedented emotion when Eddie passed away. Chris Jericho talks about hugging Benoit and Benoit sobbing uncontrollably, his tears soaking through Jericho's suit coat on his dress shirt. When Chavo reflects on Chris's reaction, you realize how Eddie's passing destroyed Benoit inside. As distraught as Benoit was, Chris Jericho points out Benoit left the funeral and immediately embarked on a WWE European tour, with Chris Jericho commenting he didn't handle it well. The close friendship between Vickie Guerrero and Nancy Benoit proves further insight into Chris's overwhelming grief. Vickie explains how Nancy stayed with her for a month after Eddie's passing, and when Chris wasn't on the road, he would come over. Chris was still grief-stricken, and she talks of how he would go to Eddie's pillow crying or go upstairs to Eddie's gym sobbing and saying, "I'm lost without Eddie being here." Nonetheless, Benoit kept his game face on at work, with friends explaining he didn't show any grief while at work. It's these personal glimpses from those close to Chris and Nancy that provide a deeper appreciation for how Chris Benoit's grief over Eddie consumed him. The documentary goes over the material we've heard before, Chris's paranoia and fighting between him and Nancy. However, it does open up new material such as a journal given to Chris for him to write to Eddie. Apparently the journal provided therapeutic and Benoit seemed to improve. The documentary covers the often asked question, why didn't anyone see the warning signs? As we've seen in anecdotes and stories, there were a number of small things but people didn't seem to connect them. For example, Chris Jericho recalls every time Chris Benoit went to a wrestling arena, he would say, "All I can think of is Eddie," with Benoit remembering when Eddie wrestled there. As the documentary mentions, Benoit became a recluse, which is why people may not have been able to put the pieces together had Benoit communicated more with them. Number 5. The crimes discovered. Dark Side of the Ring covers much of the same ground when it comes to the Benoit crimes and law enforcement's discovery of the bodies. It does provide more details, including when officers responded to the crime scene, but doesn't go into details on the investigation. Thankfully, it doesn't even bring up the bizarre conspiracy theories claiming someone else besides Chris committed the crimes. What is interesting is that Chavo Guerrero states he didn't mention Benoit's text to WWE management because he was covering for Benoit. A follow-up on this would have helped show how much the WWE knew before the Chris Benoit tribute on Raw, an often asked but still unresolved question. Fans who watched the Chris Benoit tribute show on Raw may recall wrestler William Regal discussing Benoit's passing. Regal would remark, "Now all I'm willing to say is that Chris Benoit was undoubtedly the hardest working man in all of professional wrestling." Chris Jericho explains that Regal lived in the same city as Benoit and likely knew about the fights between Chris and Nancy, and in hindsight, Regal may have suspected there was more to Benoit's family passing than suspected at the time. Ring of Hell author Matthew Randazzo discussed the crimes, describing them as brutal and vicious. He offers a timeline for the crimes, reiterating what he's covered in his book, which has its share of critics in the wrestling community. He discusses something fans haven't heard often, that Chris Benoit apparently looked up the Old Testament story about the prophet Elijah and how Elijah raised the dead. Benoit then looked up the fastest way to snap someone's neck, with Randazzo suggesting Benoit was more lucid than some have argued. He also discusses Benoit's "I'm preparing to leave this earth" note. Number 6. The aftermath. Randazzo is interviewed at length about the aftermath, including his findings that Benoit had 10 times the normal amount of testosterone in his body, yet passed a WWE wellness test. Chris Jericho counters this, arguing the WWE wellness policy was very strict and couldn't use high-powered aspirin without a prescription. Chris's dad, Mike Benoit, discusses how he read Chris's diary after his son passed away and realized he was reading the words of a man losing his mind. Again, these personal insights are what make this account of the Chris Benoit case stand out. Chris Nowinski goes down the well-trod road of his look into concussions and how CTE may have affected Benoit. What is interesting here is that Nowinski remembers a talk he had with Benoit about concussions. When he said he had 6 concussions, Benoit replied he had more concussions than he could count. Although Benoit seemed interested in Nowinski's research into concussions, he never followed up. Nowinski provides a good layperson's explanation of CTE and how it can affect someone long after their last concussion. The personal insights from Benoit's friends and family are the documentary's strongest point. Chris Jericho shares his thoughts, explaining Benoit's fate was sealed by the day Eddie passed, and that Benoit almost destroyed the only thing he ever loved, which was pro wrestling, after his criminal acts. The last bit of personal insight is the reunion of David Benoit and Nancy Benoit's sister Sandra. Chris Jericho helped reunite them after a 13-year absence, as apparently each was told the other didn't want to see the other. What wasn't covered? There's a lot to cover in the Benoit case, and while the Dark Side of the Ring provides some great interviews with Chris and Nancy's family, it falls short at times. For example, while it's helpful that the producers brought in an outsider, Matt Randazzo, to provide an outsider's perspective, It treats his account of the crime as a be-all and end-all when, as mentioned earlier, other authors have written about it in their book. It also ignores the criticism leveled at Randazzo as how well researched his book was in terms of who he interviewed. Writer Irv Muchnick could have provided additional insight, including his examination of just how much the crime was investigated and exactly when WWE officials knew about it, as well as his own research into concussions. The bizarre case of the Wikipedia post revealing the Benoit crimes before the police discovered them is not mentioned either. Ultimately, Dark Side of the Ring's profile on Chris Benoit case looks at the persons involved, deeply profiling those affected. Where it comes up short is looking at the after effects of the case, including the irresponsible reporting, the question of why the self-proclaimed wrestling journalist failed to report on Chris Benoit's domestic case, and other questions raised, including the Wikipedia post and the WWE's knowledge of the crime. If you're unfamiliar with the Chris Benoit case, Dark Side of the Ring's Benoit edition is a good starting point. At the risk of sounding self-serving, we encourage you to check out our Behind the Titantron special, The Chris Benoit Family Tragedy, and our Chris Benoit Murder Wikipedia Mystery video too. There are many factors involved leading up to the crimes, and Vice did a good job with this, particularly in putting a previously overlooked spotlight on how Benoit's crimes affected his friends and family. In that, Dark Side of the Ring excels, but in breaking new ground in other areas, it kinda fails. Have you guys seen the show? Let us know what you think about it in the comments down below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling content.